For over 100 years, Britain's mentally ill were hidden from society in vast Victorian asylums. Those who were locked away have left their own testimony.
I remember getting the first glimpse of the hospital. It's a big looming place with a clock tower and that, and I remember then thinking, oh my goodness, what am I letting myself in for?
In the last decades of the asylums, psychiatrists tried to cure as well as care for patients. Some of their attempts were barbaric.
It was a disaster. They made a hole in the skull, it went into the brain, and it waggled it a bit, and that was it.
This was a time when treatment was undergoing a revolution. Some patients felt science was being pushed too far.
He switched the probe on and burnt a piece of my brain out.
These institutions had to be shut down. When it happened, it was a moment of history that changed Britain. This is the story of the closing of the asylums and the often troubled lives they left behind. Hyroids in Yorkshire was typical of the great asylums. It was a village in its own right, with its own farms, a butcher, a bakery, even a railway station that ran right to the centre of the asylum. At its height, it held over 2,500 patients.
It was just massive. You could walk round all day and never walk round all of it. I was in the place with the longest corridors I've ever seen. There were miles of corridor.
A lot of patients were socially inadequate, not strictly speaking mentally ill, not disturbed with voices, not suffering from delusions, not showing any thought disorders at all, simply inadequate and couldn't cope. They weren't wanted. Those good burghers of Leeds and Bradford who'd sent the patients in here would certainly have thought that they were doing the right thing by the patients, although really they were doing the right thing by their towns. I think that word dumped, it's an awful word, isn't it? But you could think, and I think rightly, that a lot of patients were dumped here by their relatives, by the community. They weren't wanted, and Hyroids was a convenient place for them.
It was not just Hyroids. Many of Britain's asylums contained patients who had been locked up for no clear psychiatric reason.
People got admitted on all sorts of dubious grounds that didn't really have anything directly to do with their mental states. Their families had abandoned them, and there was no one to support them outside the institutions, even in the 1950s.
Some patients ended up in the asylums for a very long time.
This patient used to be a skilled gardener. He came here 35 years ago. And here's an old soldier. He fought in the 1418 war.
Many patients were admitted on genuine medical grounds, some of them easily treatable outside hospital nowadays.
Agoraphobia, panic turns, claustrophobia. I knew if I went walking in the street anywhere, I'd just collapse.
After the war, Joan Tugwell had left the army and was suffering genuine mental distress. She was 25 and living with her foster parents. Panic attacks were making her life a misery.
I went to bed one night and I thought I couldn't breathe, so I kept screaming out to Mum, I can't breathe, I can't breathe.
St John's Hospital near Aylesbury was Joan's local asylum. For her family, it seemed to offer some hope of refuge. She was duly committed to care.
My mother asked if I could go in, because she knew I wasn't well. Upstairs I had two big dormitories, and each of them had about 30 beds in one dormitory. So the top of one bed was down this way, the next bed up that way, and the next one down here, and then the next one up there. so that they wouldn't breathe into one another, because we're so close you're lucky we could get in to go to bed. I said, we ain't got much room to move about.
It was to be the start of a third of a century inside mental hospitals for Joan. In the early 50s, the regime was harsh. Some of those she met were not what she would have thought of as mad.
You would wonder yourself why half of them are in there. Nothing wrong with some of them, I mean. Well, there's nothing much wrong with me.
The asylum life was empty and repetitive. After months on her ward, Joan asked the nurse if she could help with the beds. It was a way of occupying herself for a part of the day.
I asked if I could make the bed. I couldn't stand there and watch her making 60 beds without giving her a hand. So we both made all the beds.
Alcohol offered an escape from her feelings of anxiety. One evening in the asylum, Joan got hold of some spirits and ended up drunk and in the wrong ward.
I was supposed to climbed over the gate, went in and said good evening to all the staff, and I passed out because I was drunk. When I came round, I was in a padded cell. They're frightening because you don't hear them and they can't hear you. Everything's all rubber. And you have canvas night dresses and canvas blankets. If you shouted, they wouldn't better hear you.
Despite the vast majority of patients having committed no offence, life in the asylums was dominated by security.
The wards were not opened. The doors weren't left open. The doors was open to let the patient out and then closed after he'd gone.
There was a quasi-prison atmosphere there. The only crime you could commit if you were a patient was to escape.
In many ways, the large asylum still housed inmates rather than patients. Conditions inside had altered little in the last half-century, but change was on its way.
This leaflet is coming through your letterbox one day soon. Read it carefully.
When the Labour government created the National Health Service in 1948, mental institutions were entirely separate from general hospitals.
Before the NHS was created, there was some debate as to whether or not the asylums and psychiatry would be included in the National Health Service, and it was decided finally that it would be included. And by including it, I think it did help to bring the systems together.
Hospitals and specialist services, medicines, drugs.
It was the parting of ways with the old poor law ideology. Notionally, the mental patient was being embraced by the NHS ethos, the whole idea of equality of membership.
While medical science had advanced rapidly in the years before the creation of the NHS, therapy for mental illness was still very limited. But now psychiatrists began to experiment with new ideas and new treatments.
You get an increasing view that mental illness is really the same as other physical illnesses and can be treated using the same sort of means, using physical interventions that work on the body.
One of these relatively new treatments was the controversial electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. It meant passing an electrical current through the brain to induce a seizure. It seemed to ease the symptoms of severe depression in some patients, though psychiatrists could not explain how it worked.
We put the wires here and here, and then we switch on, and then you'll go into a fit, have an epileptic fit.
Whole ECT units were set up so that patients could be treated in large numbers. Until the early 1950s, the procedure was carried out largely without anaesthetic.
A member of staff would lean heavily on the knees, another one at the ankles, and one at each side holding the shoulders down, and the consultant applied an electrical charge through the brain. The patient, of course, jerked very, very violently. That's why we were holding him down, because it had been known that this procedure could cause fractures and had caused fractures.
Despite appearances, ECT was regarded as a step forward. It seemed to offer some patients a real hope of improvement.
Here, insulin doses are being prepared and checked.
Another of these so-called shock treatments was insulin therapy, where doctors induced a coma by injecting large doses of insulin into the body.
Insulin coma treatment, to give it its full title, offers the greatest likelihood of relief and cure for some patients whose illness is of a deep-seated nature.
I just used to have insulin in my arm, but wasn't very nice to have. But they used some patients to go right into a coma. They would scream all the time. I mean, I think it made them feel queer.
It would burn up all the sugar in their body and drop their blood sugar level very, very low, and they would go into coma. And that was supposed to be beneficial in some way to the brain.
In this condition, the mind has a chance to be completely relaxed, and the functions of the brain have the opportunity of, as it were, setting out on a new path when consciousness returns.
Physical treatments like this advance the image of psychiatry as a fast-developing scientific branch of medicine. In reality, insulin proved a harmful medical failure. 44 people were killed from its effects during this period.
Made me bad. They give you a fit, and they had to tell you, we can't give you any more insulin because it's affecting you. It made you have a fit.
But one form of treatment was more drastic than all the others: the lobotomy. Some psychiatrists believe that by removing sections of the brain itself, certain serious mental disorders could be permanently treated. At least 15,000 of these operations, known as prefrontal leucotomies, were performed in Britain.
It was a disaster. There was a blind operation. They made a hole in the skull over which the so-called probe went into the brain, and it waggled it a bit, and that was it. There was no, until much, much later, any attempt to refine exactly where the cut was made.
There was lots of patients walking around with 2 holes on either side of their forehead that you could see the actual dint where the skull had been trepanned away and an instrument had been put in. One wonders if it had been better if they'd been left alone.
I had the misfortune to have recommended, in all, 16 of them, 16 patients who had the operation, and it was of no benefit whatsoever to any one of them, and some of them had the tragedy of personality change.
Towards the end of the 1950s, this crude form of prefrontal leucotomy was phased out. Little was then known about the workings of the brain. For most patients, there was no alternative to long periods in an asylum. They were vulnerable people, and the public was not interested. It could be a recipe for abuse. Derek McCarthy began his career as a psychiatric nurse in 1957 at St Nicholas Hospital near Newcastle. He was shocked by the treatment routinely handed out to long-stay patients.
The first time was on the first day, on the first ward that I worked on, when the charge nurse that was showing me round smacked an little old blind man across the back of the head so fiercely that he flew across the room and hit the wall. I was very shocked because the charge nurse had been quite nice to me when I came on the ward. And I was a bit lost for words, and he said, don't you know if you live among shit, you become shit?
This kind of brutality was considered almost inevitable for some of the categories of the mentally ill. On the ward for difficult patients, Derek's colleagues called this tough approach thump therapy.